Thanks everybody for joining. As Marta mentioned, we know you guys are busy and we really appreciate everyone being able to attend. It sounds like we've got a little bit of chatter on the line, so I'm just going to push through. Today we're talking about query-based reports in Maximo, or ad hoc-based reports. It's a feature that gives most users the ability to create their own reports in Maximo, and today we're going to be talking about how it's used, the features, the benefits, why you would use ad hoc-based reports. I'm going to go through a slide deck that just explains all the features and really how to get the most out of them, and then we're going to do a demo followed by a Q&A period where hopefully I can answer any of your questions. And with that, we'll get started. Let's see here. Perfect. Okay. So I'm Tom Peterson, as Marta mentioned. I'm a consultant at OnTrax. I'm out of the Edmonton office, and I've been with OnTrax for quite a few years now. I'm a certified deployment professional, and I've been working on just a ton of Maximo projects. It's what I do. And for those of you that are curious, that is the shirt I'm wearing today. So that's exactly what I look like. I do have my contact information here on this screen. And again, I'm going to have it at the end of the slide deck when we have our Q&A period. So for any of you that have questions that you don't get answered in our Q&A period, feel free to email me directly, or you can call my number there as well. So query-based reports, or ad hoc reports, we're able to create our own unique reports that show us exactly the information we need. And we find with Maximo, people spend a lot of their time entering data. They're entering work orders, filling out all of this data, and it takes a lot out of their day. But really, what's data worth unless we're able to get a view of it or get some value out of it? And that's where ad hoc reports really come in. It allows users to get value out of the data that they're spending so much time putting into Maximo. We're able to select the columns of the report that we are designing. We can identify the query that the report will run against, so we can actually filter out what result set or what data set we actually want the report to run against. You don't have to be technical, you don't need to be a developer, and you don't really need to build your own queries or custom code. These are reports for the everyman, so to speak. This is for anybody to get in and be able to create their own reports through a wizard. They don't consume development hours to create, so most report developers use, say, a BERT development environment to create super sophisticated or complex reports. We don't need that. We can actually access this tool right through Maximo, through the front end, so we're not needing the time of a report developer for these reports. Just an overview of kind of the analytics capability of the tools that are with Maximo. We basically have starting at the bottom, QBEs and app exports, so where we take a list and just dump the results into Excel, into a spreadsheet. Then we've got result sets, so set queries and data portlets that we can see on our start centers. Then we get KPIs, which take some pretty complex queries and can output numbers that give us a really good view of the data in our system. Finally, above that, in terms of analytic capability, we do have our QBR reports. These are the tools, again, that we're going to be covering today. Above that, there's BERT and Cognos and Watson Analytics, and that's where you'd really need to get a report developer in. Obviously, QBRs aren't at the very top because there are some limitations. If you want to get very advanced, you will need a report developer in BERT, but we can go quite a long way with just QBRs, and I think most of you will be quite surprised if you're not already familiar with how much you can do in QBR development. So first, we're going to cover how to create the QBRs. So we're going to be talking about the wizard screens, and the first thing that comes up is the style tab, and this is just an overview. We're going to be covering the style, the content, calculations, summaries, and then format. So to access QBRs, they can typically be accessed in any application that you or your user has access to. We can see on the side menu here, we've got just highlighted in a red box, we've got the Create Report and the Common Actions menu and the Run Reports and the More Actions menu. So creating a report is where we're going to be spending most of today's presentation, actually building a report. But for when you're you've got your report built and it's developed and ready to go, you actually run it just the same way you would run any other report using the Run Reports functionality, and that's found in the More Actions menu from the sidebar menu. And for those of you that aren't on 7.6, if you're on 7.5, that would just be in the Select Action menu that you're typically used to. Okay, so when we create a report, we click the button, it brings up the wizard as I mentioned. We got the ad hoc report title, and we can see the style tab. In the style tab, we've got two report styles. We've got a list and detail report. That's, I guess in the report style, that's the two options that you've got. We're actually just going to be covering creating a list report today. We've got the next checkbox, which is apply application query. So this is checked by default. And basically what this is if this is checked, your report is just going to run on the results that are listed in your list tab. So that's a way that you can tie a saved query. You run your saved query, which you can see in your available queries section on the sidebar menu. It'll bring a list of results, and when you run your report, it's just going to pull from those results. If you have this unchecked, what ends up happening is your report will pull from the entire data set. So if you're, say, running a report in the work order application, you would be querying all work orders that you've got in your system. So I find this is a pretty useful feature, especially for those that aren't necessarily familiar with too much of filtering data sets. It's really easy to just create my own result set or use my advanced search to filter the results I want and then run my query on that. Of course, every report needs a title, so this would be where you add your title into the report. So this will be when you select it from your run reports, this is the title that you're going to be searching for. And finally, you've got your share option. So if you check this, that means any other user in the system will have access to view your report once it's done. No other users can edit it, that's only you, but they will be able to see it. So if you want this report to just be for you or not, take up anyone else's report list, or take up space on there, you can leave that unchecked. But if you're, say, an administrator, an IT user, or a power user, and you think this report would give a lot of other users at your company some value, then it would make sense to maybe share it. And you would do that by clicking that checkbox. Okay, so I got a little bit ahead of myself, but basically what I'm showing here is exactly what I just mentioned about the application query. You can use your saved queries, you can use your advanced search functionality to filter down your results, and that happens when that box is checked. I talked about the title, and we already kind of know about that. That's pretty straightforward. And now we're going to be talking about the two different types of reports, so the list and the detailed report. So at first glance, the list actually seems pretty basic and straightforward, where you just basically just decide what columns I want in my report. So in this example here, we've got work order, description, location, asset, and so on, and it just lists all of your work orders. And there's really not that much to it. So now if I show, computer's getting a little bit behind on me, a detailed report, I can actually see that my records now are grouped by different sections. But what's interesting, and we're going to find this today, is the list actually gives you a little bit more functionality in terms of what I can group by. If I select a detailed report, the system will automatically group it by the object that the data is coming from, and a list report I can group by pretty much whatever criteria I want. So even though a detailed looks a little bit more intuitive and a place where I can get a little bit more informative data out of it, we're going to be talking about how to make a list report work for you today. So a QBR list report versus detailed reports, a few other details that I've got here is the number of relationships that I can select. The detailed report has no limit, whereas list report restricts you to one or less. The ability to select the detailed report and only select fields from the main table of the application. In this case, all fields will display in the header section. And then basically what I kind of mentioned is your group by functionality in the detailed report is auto grouped by field category, whereas your list report, if you do want grouping, you have to configure that manually, but that does give you a little bit of functionality. Andy, I see you raised your hand there, and we'll take note of that when you do have a question at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. So now that we've talked about the style tab, we are going to talk about the content. So we talked about how we want the report to look, but now we decide what's actually going to be in our report. So the next tab over is the content tab. We can select a parent category. Most people don't realize this, but in the parent category, you have a few options that you can select from here. Typically, there's one parent category that's selected by default, and that allows you to choose what objects you're going to be getting your information from. So in this example here, we've got work order details. So if I have my work order details highlighted, which it is, I've got 360 fields, work order fields to be able to choose from, and those are all fields on my main object, but I do have the ability to select fields from a related object, so I could actually click on the asset or locations below in the parent category section, and I can actually choose fields from my asset or location object. So I can actually get a pretty dynamic, detailed report. One example of this would be, say, if I wanted to see the work order and the work order description, but I also wanted to see my location description. If I clicked on my location here and choose the description in my available field section, I could get my related attribute, I guess, from my location object. So now in the available fields section, I was kind of talking about this. This is the available fields that I can choose to have in my report. They're not necessarily the ones that are in my report. It's just the pool of fields that I can draw from. So what I need to do is go in there and check which fields, and I can search using the filter at the top of the columns. I can put some search criteria to find the fields I want. And once I've found the ones I've wanted, I check them with the little checkbox on the side and click the Add Selected button. Once they're selected, they go into the Selected Fields section, and I can see in this example I've got 8 fields that are actually going to be in my report. So that's how I know specifically what's in my report. Now, a few details that I just wanted to talk about here. We can see that we've got an order here. That's pretty obvious, but most people actually do forget that. How do I determine what order my columns exist in my report? That's set right here. So the order will basically be from left to right, the order of columns in your report. The category is also what object this came from. So your detailed reports automatically sort by your category. And we'll go through an example. We'll see how different fields will have different categories. We're not going to go through a detailed report, but we can see that the different category is set. In this example here, they all happen to be from the work order object, so they all have the same category. So when I talked about the parent category, I guess, or the parent object, what I'm doing is selecting a report object structure. And this is going to get a little bit more technical. This is more of an advanced topic, the report object structures, but basically it's a grouping of objects. It's preset on how these different objects relate. So I can see here in my example, I've got work orders and I've got assets, but how do those relate? On what object do they relate? Probably the asset number on the work order and your site ID, typical ways to relate those two objects. But that might not necessarily be the case, and it might not be what I want when I'm building my report. So you can actually create your own list or I guess report object structures that list all of the objects that you can select from and set how they relate to each other. Again, you would need admin access to get to the object structure application. So that's not for everybody, and typically the ones that are existing out of the box do meet most of everyone's needs. All right. Now to remove fields. So by default, when I'm creating my report and I've got some fields selected, by default, there's typically already some fields selected. So when I create an ad hoc report on the work order object, it already thinks I'm going to need my work order number, my description, my location, but that might not be what I actually want to see in my report. So if I don't want all of the fields that the system has defaulted in there, I'm able to remove them almost the same way that I was able to add them from the available field section. I just click the checkbox beside them and then click the buttons down at the bottom. I can remove all, which ignores the checkbox and just removes everything from this list, or I can just check a field or two and then remove selected, and it'll pull it back from the selected fields section and it'll pull it into the available field section. So I can always add it back in if I want. So now that we've decided what content, so we've got the fields that we've actually chosen and the columns of our report, now we can actually create some calculations. So that's done on the Calculate tab, which is one tab over. So the Calculate tab enables the users to add calculations or expressions as a column to their ad hoc report. And that's the real cool thing, is when I'm running my report, I can't actually tell by looking at it what fields have been calculated and what ones are just standard fields that exist in the database. It's a very powerful feature, as the user can add simple to complex content to the report that business decisions are based on. So I can look at some summaries of costs or planned costs or whatever the case may be based on adding all of the different cost types for work orders. That's an example that I'm going to be using today, and I think it's a pretty common example as well. Only qualified users with very strong understanding of database attributes and SQL functions should have access to this feature. You know, that might be the case for a lot of organizations, but I think when we get into it, you'll find that it's actually fairly simple. As long as you can find the fields and you know how they should relate to each other, whether they should be added or divided or whatever the case may be, it's pretty simple functionality. One note that people might run into down the road is that all attributes must be from the same object. So all attributes in one expression. So I can't say add a work order priority to an asset priority because they're from different objects. So I would run into a few errors when I tried that. Perfect. So this is what the actual tab looks like. And again, it's in the same wizard. We're just going from left to right. We've started on style. Next, we went to content, and now we're in calculate. So what we do is the same way we pick the content, we go to our available fields section and we search for the fields that we want. Once we find the fields that we want, we click the checkbox on the side and we add selected. Now what's going to end up happening is the fields that were selected get put into the expression section down below. In the expression section, we can see that we've got scheduled finish minus scheduled start. And you're actually only going to be able to use fields that are number based. So you can use, say, a priority or a date or a cost. You can add and subtract and do any kind of math calculation to it, but you're not going to be able to use something like a description. I can't add a description to a priority, right? That mathematically isn't a thing that can happen. So you're going to find your available fields list is actually a little bit shortened than all of the fields on your object, and that's just because it pre-filters out anything that is basically alphanumeric based, so ALNs for those of you that are a little bit more on the technical side. Once I select my fields, I am going to have to determine what kind of operator I'm going to have in between there. So scheduled start minus scheduled finish, I have to put that manual in there. And then beside that on the right side, I've got a test expression. I always recommend that you click that button. And the reason why is because I want to know that the system will know how to run my expression before I start seeing errors in my report. So if you want to verify that now, ahead of the time where you're actually running the report, you always click that test expression and it'll give you a little pop-up whether there's an error or everything's, A-okay. I have to give it a name. So the name here is what's going to show up as my column header as my report. So again, to remind you guys, this is just going to show up as basically a new field in my report. So when I actually run my report, I'm going to have a column called days to complete, and it's just going to give me an integer value. You can see by the data type there. Once I've set everything in my expression and I've given it a name and a data type, I need to click the Add Expression button, and then it's going to show up in the expressions list down here. These expressions lists, you can have more than one, and those are basically going to be what show up as new columns. If you just leave the data in your expression and your name and you didn't click the Add Expression list, nothing new is going to show up on your report. So be aware of that. If you're finding that your calculator field just isn't showing up, chances are you haven't added it to your expressions list. So it's just one extra step that you have to be aware of. So we can see in this example here, we've got a report, we've got the list of fields, we've got work order, description, asset, status, scheduled start, priority, and site. And now I've got an estimated cost field. So that's an actual calculated field. And from this view, it doesn't actually look like anything that's out of the database or calculated on the fly. It just shows up like any other field would. Okay, so the test expression functionality, I talked about it. It lets you know if your calculation is going to be right or if it's going to have issues. You can check the attributes. Are they in the correct format? Typically, if you're just clicking the checkbox and clicking Add Attributes, they are going to be right. It checks your functions, making sure that you're doing proper mathematical functions here. And you also check that you're not doing a division by zero, which is just mathematically impossible, and the system just doesn't know how to deal with it. You create your expression library, or you can select your expression library. I'll be honest, I don't typically use that. We can see that we've got 5 values here: date, time, round, case when. Typically, most of the expressions that I see people using are just your typical add, subtract, maybe even a divide in this area here. But if you guys are interested in that, you can always select that from the lookup little magnifying glass over there. Cool. So we finished calculate. Now we're going to move on to summarize. So summarize is very similar to calculating, but instead of calculating field by field, or I guess row by row, what we're actually going to do is provide a summary that takes a calculation over a grouping of records. So if you're doing a list and you're not grouping anything, it's going to take your entire data set. Whereas if you group by, say, a location, we're going to do a summary that's applied to each grouping. So location 1 would have a summary based on just those results. Location 2 would have a summary based on other results. And that's really the biggest difference between summarize and calculations. So you've got the ability to define summaries to selected attributes in their ad hoc report. You can predetermine attributes available, or I guess that's more functions available. You can figure out your total, you can figure out your count, you can figure out your average. So if you've got, say, an average priority of work at a certain location, you can figure out your min, max, median, or mode. So you've got a few functions that are available. I find typically your total and your average are used most often. So we can see here in our list report or our grouping summaries reports, at the top of each grouping section, you're actually going to have your summary values here. So as we go through our report, we can see our total budgeted has a number here, our minimum based on these functions, and our average year to date. So we've actually got 3 summary calculations being done on this report. And we can see here in the lower one, the grouped assets report, we can see different summaries based on the different groupings, however this report happened to be grouped. That's typically it for summaries, and we'll go into a little bit more details on how they're used when we get into our example. Now we're going to be talking about format. So the formatting tab is where we decide what we're going to be filtering. So for those of you that are familiar with running reports in Maximo, typically when you run a report, you're going to get a little pop-up box that says, hey, please select these values. Say, select your site, select a status. Those are filters that have been pre-set up in your report. And the way those are set up is in your filtering section here. So these are read-only fields, by the way. I don't know if you guys can tell on your screen that they're grayed out. I do actually have to use my lookup little magnifying glass on the side to select what fields I'm able to filter on. You don't have to use these. I guess what I should start by saying is all of this is optional. It's only up to you on how you want to filter your report. And I should say that typically for the calculate and summary as well. That's totally optional. If you don't have anything you want to calculate or summarize or filter by or group by, you don't need to do any of this. This is only informational if you guys think this is of value when creating your report. The next thing is grouping. So when I talked about grouping by certain attributes, that's where I select that. So if I want to group by, say, a location, I can click the magnifying glass, select location. If I want to group by asset, or if I want to group by priority or status of whatever object you're working on, that would be where I do it. And you can actually see I'm able to group by a few things at a time. I don't see this typically done very often, but we're able to group by, say, a location and then a priority or whatever the case may be. And we can see it's cut off a little bit down at the bottom of the screen. We've also got sorting. This just puts the records in whatever order you want. So if I want to sort by work order number or by date or by work order number and then by status, whatever sorting I want, it'll sort each grouping of record by whatever the criteria you've set in your sort. And for those of you that are wondering how it looks exactly like the grouping and filtering section. So should be pretty familiar. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are actually able to click on the lookup. It's going to give us a list of filters, or I guess a list of fields that we can use to filter on. And these are just the fields that you've already got selected in your report. And we can see here in the boxed out section, we've got a few fields that we're able to filter on. So that's just a typical use case that we're seeing here. Grouping's the same. We can group on one or more objects, or none, I guess, to be technical. We can add a group on as many as we want, but it has to be fields that exist or that we've selected to our report. And then same goes for sorting here as well. So once the user has created the report, what happens next? Well, they can run or click the button that says Run and Save Completed Report. This will automatically run it. You got to allow pop-ups because it's going to be a pop-up in your screen, and it's going to show you what your report looks like. And then it saves it. So now in my Run Report section, I'm actually going to have my report, whatever title I've given it, will show up in that list. This will display the report output in the report browser and also saves the report design file to your database. Alternatively, if I wanted to preview it and make sure I've really nailed down that format before I save it, I'm able to click the Preview Report button, and it'll just show me what my report looks like without actually saving it to my database. Once I've actually finished my report, like I mentioned, I access it in my Run Report section in my More Actions menu, and it's going to show up here in the list, but we can tell which one's ours. So I'm not Leanne, I've stolen Leanne's report. We can tell which one's ours though, because we've got the little edit button beside it and the trash can beside it. So if you're worried that, I've created a report, but I didn't quite get it right, how am I going to go back and fix it? Well, if I click that edit button, which is just the page and the pencil on top of it, it's going to bring up the same editor that we saw when we actually created the report. We can make our changes and modify the details as needed. We can also delete the report if you think, hey, this is a waste of time. Someone's already built a report that does this and then some, so I don't actually need my report. And you would just delete it by clicking the trash can there. And obviously, you can't do that to other people's reports, so that's why you're only able to see those buttons on reports that you've created. We can set up a report schedule. So if I hold on one second. The report and schedules is when we run a report. If I edit the report, it goes back to the window. I just mentioned that, so that's what this slide is basically trying to say here. The thing I'm going to touch on very briefly is the report object structure. So I mentioned this is more of an admin thing, so this is how we can actually tell what attributes and objects and how they're grouped together. I'm just going to go over a quick overview in the slides and just show, in case you guys want to come back and reference this later. But the way we're able to do this is we go to the object structures application, and we can tell what object structures already exist in the system. They're typically prefixed with REP, meaning they're reports. But if I want to find everything that's reporting based, I would look in my consumed by, and it would say reporting. For those of you that are familiar with this application, that's the word I'm looking for, it is also where we create our object structures for integration and migration objects as well. Once we're in there, it's created the exact same way. So we decide what objects we want to have in our object structure. So this tells us what's the parent of that data hierarchy. We can actually choose the object. We can give it a reporting description. So that would be what shows up in that little blue list of parent category. We can add multiple objects together, and this is how we group them together. So we can see PR line, it knows what the parent is, so PR line's parent is PR. And the relationship that's defined of how these fields relate is in your relationship section here. So you should have a few options. If you don't have a relationship that makes sense to you, you'd have to create your own using database config. Again, this is very admin stuff, not for the typical users, so we're not going to spend too much time on it here. We also have the ability for each of these objects to decide what attributes are included or excluded. Typically, I would just include everything and let people choose what they want on their report. But if the admin decides, hey, I don't want people to be able to run reports on these certain fields, they can actually exclude it from the object structure, which would restrict access when actually building a report itself. Finally, once the report object structure is in the system, you won't be able to use it right away. I wouldn't be able to choose my report object structure in my parent category when creating an ad hoc report until I've been granted security access. And now that's done from the report administration application, which is in the admin console. I'd actually have to go to that application in my More Actions, click the Set Report Object Structure Security, find out the newly created report object structure. So I've got TP inventory details, TP for Tom Peterson, of course. And then I decide that the group max admin will have access to use this report object structure going forward. I can set any other group that has access to create reports as well. Okay, so enough of these slides that are clicking through. We're going to actually get into a demo here. So I'm going to open up my browser and we're going to use the #1 user in the world, Mike Wilson. This guy is the best Maximo guy ever. He's at every organization. And for those of you that aren't familiar, that's the demo user that IBM typically uses. So we're going to get into this. We're going to do a quick little demo here, and it's basically going to show everything that I've shown in my slides. We're going to go to the work order application, and we're going to create a new report for the report or work orders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my common actions on the side, and I'm going to click Create Report. I'm going to choose a list report. Again, we talked about the difference between list and detail. I want to use my application query because I want to make sure that the results I've got in my results set here are what is pulled into my report. I don't want to share because I don't think my report is going to be of value to anybody else. It's pretty specific to me, so I'm going to actually keep it for myself. So let's say webcast report. That'll be pretty easy to find later, and we're happy with that. Now, if I go to my content tab, I can see that I've got my work orders, my assets, my locations. I can actually change this here and choose any other parent category. So when I was talking about report object structures, these are different report object structures that will give you different fields to choose from. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but my actual list did change. I'm going to go back to my original one, and we can see that the original list is back. My selected fields that were predetermined, those are gone. As soon as we change the object structure, the system has to assume that those fields might not exist, so it automatically removes them from our report. So let's go through and create a report really quick. So I'm going to look for work orders. Let's say work order. I'm going to click it, and I'm going to add the selected field to my selected field. So I've got a report that just shows one field at the moment. Let's say description. I'm going to add that as well. I'm going to choose location. I'm going to add that as well. And you can see I'm using the filtering functionality quite heavily. Now let's go to locations, and let's add my location description. I'm going to click that, and now what ends up happening is I can see that I've got two fields called description. One's from my location, obviously we can see from the category, and one's from my work order. And we can see here our category is different. We're going to give this a little bit more of an intuitive name so I can differentiate the two. So location and location description. And that's when, or this basically becomes the heading of my column, so I'm able to see the difference here. I'm going to go back to work orders, and I'm going to add a few cost columns because I want to see my costs by location. So I'm going to go to actual labor cost. I'm going to go to actual material cost. I'm going to also add my actual service and my tool cost. So I can add a few at a time. We're going to add selected here. Perfect. And now we're also going to add priority. Low priority. We're going to add selected. I think we're happy with that, so we're going to move on next to the calculate section. So I'm going to go to the calculate section, and I'm actually going to create a calculation that gives me my total cost. So I'm going to take my actual labor, service, material, and tools, and I'm going to just sum them together. So I'm going to click my actual label or labor, actual material. I'm going to click my service and my tool, and I'm going to add selected. And now what happens here is they go down to my expression box, and I've got no operators in between here. So it's on me to decide how I want these fields to interact with each other. So I'm just going to sum these together. Very basic, very simple. Remember your orders of operations. So if I want to, times one by another and add a couple, I can always enforce the order of operations with brackets. I can do that. Of course, addition, this actually doesn't change anything. We just add to add to add. That's no big deal. But it just shows us that we have a little bit of control here. So I'm going to test my expression. Hey, it was successful. This means that when I run my report, this field will know how to calculate this, and it won't throw any errors. Again, this doesn't do anything. This won't be on my report. I have to give it a name first, so I'll give it a name of total cost. I'm going to add the expression, and I have to make sure that it's down in this section here first before I move on, because if I just left it where it was, it doesn't actually get added to my report. Okay? Next thing, we're going to create a summary. So what I want to do is we're going to create a report. We're going to group it by location, and I want to create or show you guys an average priority for each location. So prio. I can just partially type it in. I'm going to click priority. So it pulls in the field here, and I pull my function. I don't get the chance to type it. I just have to select it from here. So I know that I'm going to choose, or for each grouping of record, I'm going to get the average priority. So I'm going to add my values here. And again, nothing happens while the fields are just at the function and field. I have to actually add it to the summary section, and everything listed here will be actually added into my report. Good, so far, perfect. We're happy with this. Let's move on to format. So we can create a filter if we want. We don't have to. I'm going to do one just because we can. We can just say, hey, select priority. So now when I do my pop-up, we're going to get a pop-up that says, give me a priority value that I can filter on. And again, even if I have a filter here, that doesn't necessarily make it required. I can still ignore that. I talked about this. We want to group our work orders by location. So we're going to select the grouping of locations. So this is going to give us different sections in our report and for each location, and it's going to give us just the work orders for those locations. And finally, we're going to choose sorting. And very common, let's sort by work order number. So I'm pretty happy with that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save and run completed report. And I hope it works. I've got my fingers crossed. Of course, it takes a little bit because it's querying the database. So it's looking pretty good so far. We can see here for location, we've got an empty location, our average priority. So this is our summary field. So for all work orders that have no location, the average priority is 3.98. And for those of you that can't really see that, I'll zoom in a little bit. Average priority is 3.98. Oh, no, sorry, that's for the total. For location empty, we've got an average priority of 5. So it actually does a summary for your entire result set as well. We can see we've got our work order numbers. The work order numbers are sorted just as we'd expect. That's perfect. We've got our description. We've got our location description. So if there's no location, of course, there can be no location description. We can see our actual costs coming in for our different cost types and priorities. And then over here, maybe I'll zoom out just a little bit here. We can see our total cost. Oh, actually, it doesn't help at all. We can see our total cost. So this is our calculated value. And is it working? Let's have a look. We've got actual service costs on this line of 1,000. We've got actual material costs of 171. So when added together, our total costs are 1,171. So this is looking good. And as we go through, we're going to see the results. So for this location, we've only got one work order. We can see the one work order. We can see all of our calculated costs. We can see our summary for that one work order. For location boiler, we've got a few more work orders where we can see the work orders sorted. We can see the average priority. And again, all of our calculated costs are sitting there. So that looks good too. And I'm going to zoom back out here. That's saved, so we're happy about that. When I go to run reports now, I can see my webcast report is sitting here. I can edit it. That's going to bring up my ad hoc reporting wizard once again. And when I click it, now I can actually see my priority. So it's going to filter all work orders where my priority is, say, anything other than 5. Again, this is optional. I can do that, or I can leave it empty. This is also where we put in our scheduling information. So if I've built, say, a work backlog report that I want to have on my desk every Monday morning, I can save a query that will run, or that this report will run on, and I can schedule this to show up every Monday morning. So I'm still able to schedule reports, same as any other report that you've got in the system there. Let's just, for good measure, run our report with priority 5 and see how it goes. So now we've got a much different list. We can see our average priority is 5 across the board, and that makes sense because for each of these groupings, it's only grabbing our work orders with priority 5. So that is a pretty quick demo. I think it covers almost everything that ad hoc reports can do. There are a few limitations. So if you want to get a little bit more complex into the functionality, you're probably going to need to get a report developer, but that's fine. I mean, this takes us quite a long way into developing pretty intuitive reports. So I hope you guys like the demo. What we're going to do next, I don't know why I'm opening my browser when I mean to go back into my slide deck, is we're going to open up the line for any questions that you have, and I will try my best to answer them for the rest of the time we've got.